Cool. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what will be the first of many 4Sight Growth 4.0 webinars. Today, we're very, very fortunate that we've got one of our non-executive directors from the 4Sight board, Herman Singh, who's going to be joining us this afternoon to take us through an awesome presentation about where does this leave our cloud strategy. So just a bit of an introduction for you guys to Herman. He's been a veteran of the telecoms and digital space for the last 20 years, 25 years. Most notably, held very senior positions at Standard Bank, where he looked after the mobile money and digital side of things, as well as at Vodacom. And then most recently was the Chief Digital Officer for MTN Group, focused on digital and innovative solutions across their 235 million subscribers. So Herman is going to take us through one of his keynote presentations around cloud and share some of his experiences and insights from the last couple of years. Herman, I'd like to hand over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks, John, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a Friday afternoon. It's 3 o'clock, and I'm guessing in a normal office I'd be between you and the sundowners, but seeing as I can't see you and you're all at home sitting behind your screens, I'm guessing the sundowners are out already. So I won't take up too much of your time. I've got an hour. I'll be talking for about 45 minutes. I'm just going to put this camera off only because I just need to conserve network here. I think I'm a bit slow. My son's playing Call of Duty upstairs, I think. And what I wanted to talk to you about is basically a presentation I've done recently for a company called Nutanix. For those of you that don't know, Nutanix is the biggest IPO'd company in 2016. So in that year, they had the biggest multi-billion-dollar IPO. They're basically a unicorn. And they asked me, and they're one of the big hyperscalable, virtualized, hybrid cloud providers. They asked me to put together a presentation for their team. And I'm running you through that presentation, but modified for 4Sight. So what I wanted to talk about is how is the world changing before the pandemic? Clearly, we were on a growth path and a trajectory already. What did the pandemic actually trigger in terms of changes in the world? What was the kind of stress test that occurred globally, and how did we pass it or fail it? What questions are we asking ourselves about now, given what we've learned? And what are some of the key takeouts that we as, I guess, service providers, vendors, and in many cases, I guess, customers have to be thinking about? So the first point, I guess, is that the world was changing radically anyway before this hit. And everyone talks about work from home as if it's a radical new thing. In fact, it isn't. If you look at the way that that work has been changing over the last few years, in fact, the last 5 years alone, you can see we've moved from hierarchical organizations to flattened organizations. Flexible working hours have been the norm. We've moved towards cloud technology in a big way, more virtualized desktops, work from anywhere, work from any time, and basically a world where we moved from email as being the primary form of communication to, I guess, email being a secondary form of communication. So the world of work had already been changing for a long time. What had made that possible, of course, was the rapid adoption of connectivity, smart devices, and apps. If you think about the adoption of mobile technology just in the last decade, it's been adopted 2 times faster than internet adoption in the 90s, 3 times faster than social networking was adopted in the 2000s, and 10 times faster than PCs were adopted in the 1980s. If you have a look at the propensity of people to make use of this mobile technology, 67% of respondents have said in recent surveys that teleworking improves work quality, and 69% said that teleworking improves productivity. Your average person worldwide is already sitting with about 3.5 devices in their home, and that's just their own. So the arrival of connectivity allowed us to basically work from anywhere, and the arrival of apps fundamentally changed the way that we conducted our work. So from management to daily work to work teams to accessing company resources, SharePoint, for example, all the way through to training, both company organized training or MOOCs like Coursera, Udemy, through to events, and even through to professional learning. In fact, we are running this event now using Microsoft Teams, which is one of the eventing apps. So apps basically allowed us to fundamentally change the way in which we designed and constructed our workday. And so the workday therefore changed. We changed where we worked, we changed when we worked, and we changed how we work. And so in the past workday, you had a fixed time cycle. Today, I mean, I've got clients in Saudi Arabia. I sometimes work with clients in Japan, Singapore, Dubai, America. And my workday is basically my customer's workday. I make use of, I guess, over 100 apps these days. And so the world shifted fundamentally to the point where, work is a thing that I do, not a place that I go to. And we all basically have become road warriors. We are no longer pinned or pegged to a place. One of the other things that we've seen is the massive adoption of videos. If you look globally, video has been growing at probably 40 to 50% a year. And if you have a look at the international bandwidth consumption on the backhaul, you can see on many transatlantic cables, the consumption of video on that cable in terms of total capacity can be anywhere between 70 and 80%. So that's the world we were in before we entered the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit. Now, we all went into lockdown, and the world looked like quite a different place. A number of things were triggered by the pandemic, and so we kind of had the stress test. Now, actually, we've had stress tests on the internet many times. When Amazon has a Prime Day, or you get Black Friday, websites go down, e-commerce sites can't handle it. If you think about the Mayweather fight, you'll remember that the internet basically buckled because so many people wanted to watch that particular single pay-per-view stream. When Disney launched Disney Plus earlier this month, the internet in Europe, for example, took quite a hit. When they have major snowstorms in Canada or America, in fact, people work from home. This is a normal thing out there, especially in areas that are prone to high levels of snow. So basically, we've had regional stress tests on the internet for many times. What we've never had, I guess, is really a single global coordinated system stress test, where basically huge numbers of people just stayed at home, children stayed at home, and we saw the internet, the applications, the cloud infrastructure, almost every element of our IT system take massive load. In fact, the only part of the system that didn't take load were in the offices where we used to work. Now, how well did we pass? And that's really what I want to talk about, is how well did we pass and what are the implications for the future? If you have a look at this diagram, I basically got this from, I think, this is from Oxford, but I downloaded it from the BBC. And what it talks to is how severe the lockdown was in different parts of the world. So the darker the color, the harder the lockdown. So a dark color here means a national lockdown. The orange means there were national recommendations. The pink means it's a localized lockdown, and the yellow means it's localized recommendation. The black line is when the first case was discovered. So it shows you globally. I mean, South Africa, I think, is, if you can see my cursor, you can see South Africa is third from the top. We kind of pretty typical in the world. Everyone says we reacted really quickly. Senegal reacted quite late, but other countries in Africa, if you look at the Congo, for example, they reacted relatively quickly. I'd argue, of course, that they probably had the virus and didn't know. Anyway, in South Africa, from the time we had the first case until we had the lockdown was relatively quick, something like 2 weeks, in fact, 10 days from the first patient until the lockdown. Now, if you look across this, you can see we had varying levels of lockdown. If you look at Europe, for example, they've had a lockdown that's been running, a hard lockdown that's been running for a long time. The rest of the world, not as severe. The Americas, I think North America in particular, had quite a severe lockdown, and you can see in Asia as well. So varying levels of lockdown around the world. Net, we ended up at a peak of 4.5 billion people globally under lockdown. Now, the reason that's important is that a lot of these people were able to work from home. Not everybody can work from home. I'll show you that on the next slide. But 50% of employers were engaged in some form of work from home. If you look at these little houses here, that shows you the increases in work from home from 2018 to 2019, 18%. And then there was quite a significant jump to pre-COVID, and then another jump to post-COVID. So basically 2019 to 2020 ended up being a jump of almost 50% in terms of people working from home. Simultaneously with that happening, there was a dramatic increase in the number of learners who actually were basically impacted by COVID, and a lot of these learners ended up studying from home as well. So what you had was roughly 1.4 billion learners basically working from home, and so you had this really interesting contention in the home, where you had, you know, mom or dad wanting to work online, you know, Oma, Opa wanting to watch Netflix, the children on their gaming consoles. My daughter's always on YouTube. So you kind of get a sense that this severely stressed a number of things, never mind the relationships themselves. So working from home is not possible for everyone. You can see here on the top right-hand corner that 60% of management, business, and financial workers are able to work from home. But as you get into some face-to-face services, construction, maintenance, transportation, of course, quite logically, these folks can't work from home. There are a number of of jobs in the world where you physically have to be at your place of work. Now, if you have a look at what happens when a company is impacted, you can see on the bottom graph on the left-hand side, that's what a company looks like when there's no confirmed cases of COVID-19 in their footprint, and you can see what happens the minute there's an event happening. Now, the reason that this is important is we haven't yet reached a steady state, so we don't really know whether level 3 is going to be steady state. Are we going to change to level 2, level 1? And if you get to level 1, what are the chances that you're going to go back to level 3 and back to level 5? The state of Georgia in America is now lifted. In fact, they've pretty much gone back to normal. You can go to any restaurant. There's no special seating arrangements. You can go to cinemas. Everything's back to normal. The infection rate is horrific. And so my expectation is very soon Georgia is going to have to slam the door down again. And this is known as the hammer and the dance. And the hammer and the dance is the recommended process for actually dealing with a pandemic. What you do is you basically come down like a hammer, and you lock the entire country down so that you can defend your hospitals and your medical staff. And what you also do is you basically make everybody stay at home. And it shuts down commercial activity. That's the hammer. The dance starts when you start to open up, because as you open up the environment, what happens is you start to get localized outbursts, and as you get these localized outbreaks, you have to dance around them. And so there's a lot of finesse around, you know, which job categories do I now stop, which areas do I now quarantine, etc. So what we've got to understand is this graph here is now going to be reflective of the way the world's going to look probably for the next 2 years until we've got a vaccine or everybody reaches herd immunity. So how have we responded to this work from home environment? Well, fundamentally, it's changed the flow of data, and in particular, the flow of data on messaging apps. Google Duo, for example, saw a 12% jump. Nextdoor saw a 73% jump. I think this graph here has been cut, but that's House Party, which is another app. I think many of you would have used it. That's seen like an 80% jump. But that fades into insignificance when you consider Zoom. Zoom went up 800%, and that's about in a month. Skype went up 200%, and you can see WhatsApp, Grab, and other Line, for example, and Facebook Messenger all went up quite significantly. The bottom right-hand side, it shows you the rapid uptake in business messaging on WhatsApp within a 1 month period. So clearly, huge move towards the use of applications. What we similarly saw was a bigger adoption of video. Facebook saw a 50% increase in messaging, but a doubling in the use of video. In Italy, specifically, 70% more time was spent across the Facebook apps during the crisis that they've seen. And there was 1,000%, you can see this graph here, there was 1,000% increase in the use of group calling over in Italy during this particular period. So you can see this heavy dependence that we've all got now on messaging apps, the internet, mobile connectivity, and obviously cloud. Now, not all services were up. Netflix in South Africa peaked at 32% higher on a Sunday. I'm sorry, 32% higher on a Wednesday. And that compares to the peak, which normally occurs on a Sunday. And so you can see big uptake in Netflix. And many people sitting at home were not, in fact, working, Tertius. And you can see here that although Netflix was up significantly, Spotify, in fact, saw a 23% drop, not just in Italy, but across Europe, England, and the United States. And the reason for that is there's an assumption that a lot of people listen to music mainly when they're in transit, but when they are not in transit, they actually are not listening to music. And so that was a very illustrative, I guess, outcome, number one. Number two, it also indicates that productivity levels probably went up because we just didn't have time to listen to music. We were always on calls. You can see the dramatic increase globally in the use of Zoom. In fact, people often misread this graph. Zoom is actually the light blue, and the dark blue is actually all other web conferencing products. So what many people don't realize is the extent to which Zoom dominates the web conferencing market, number one. And number two, again, people don't realize that Zoom actually hit 300 million users from 10 million users almost within a month. So as a direct result of that, the valuation of Zoom, you can see the massive growth in the number of users here from December 2019 to April 2010 was 300 million users. So it grew 30 times, 30x. That's almost unheard of. So Zoom as a company is now valued at $50 billion, which is worth more than probably the top 6 airlines in the world combined. Probably not the top 6 airlines in the world, just the top 6 airlines that fly into the United States. You can see here the valuation of each of the airlines. Now, why am I comparing Zoom, the Zoom boom as they call it? Why am I comparing it to airlines? I'm comparing it to airlines because you can see here the collapse in the number of flights. The TSA is the Transport Security Authority in the United States. On March the 10th of this year, had 1.6 million people going through American airports. In fact, 2.1 million people going through airports. And by April 2nd, which was kind of 3 weeks later, they were down to 124,000. So basically, that's a reduction of 95% of people. So instead of sending the work, instead of sending the people, we sent the work. So we didn't transport people, we transported work. And that's really important to change. That's why we do this juxtaposition between video conferencing and transportation. Because really the one is almost exact replacement for the other, especially for business. And so in the recovery that we see coming, we expect to see quite a large reduction in business travel, because I think many executives are going to have quite a jaundiced view about business travel. Why do you have to fly for a meeting? Why can't you just do it on Zoom? You've survived fine for 3 months. Obviously, things like holidays and seeing family probably still require you to travel, but we do expect to see an increase in holiday travel, family travel. But we do expect to see a dramatic reduction in business travel, which is a huge problem for the airline industry because they make a large percentage of their revenue, in fact, from business class travel. So huge jump in that. Now, the challenge, of course, is you've seen this amazing uptake in all of these services. And what I guess is maybe not well understood is if the number of users is increasing, and I never showed you this, but many of the online services had a large increase in the number of subscribers. And the existing subscribers used it more, and they used more of the internet. And all of this obviously trickles back to the platforms at the back end, which are applications, all of which runs in probably 5 or 6 big cloud platforms. So if you think about it, you think about Alibaba, you think about Oracle, IBM, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Azure, and you kind of, that's it. There's 5 or 6, and Facebook, of course, runs their own cloud. So basically, there's about 5 or 6 major cloud platforms that run the world. That's probably 90% of the traffic in the world. So we suddenly saw this massive hit across the internet to all those cloud platforms because of the fact that the applications were hosted on a limited number of platforms. By the way, as a direct result of what's happened, Netflix's profits are expected to drop. In fact, many of the companies like Spotify and Netflix are expected to drop. The reason is that they pay on a per user basis at companies like Amazon, and the number of users of sessions went up, the number of users went up slightly, but the usage of the services went up. And so Netflix was receiving revenue based on number of subscribers, but they were paying on the number of individual streams and the usage of resources at the back end. So Netflix's costs went up, but the revenue remained flat. So that's not so bad. I mean, if you look at companies like Uber and Airbnb, their revenue dropped something like 90%. WeWork's revenue has dropped substantially more. Now, the pandemic stress test, as I've said, has basically stressed that environment that I've just shown you. It's because of the way that we've architected it. And how did we architect it? Well, if you think back to where we used to be with traditional on-prem, you basically had applications consuming data in a runtime environment using middleware, sitting on top of an operating system, possibly with some virtualization software running across multiple servers with probably a storage access network. And all of that was networked both internally and externally. That's how we started. And then we moved into an infrastructure as a service market. So companies have stepped in, Terraco, for example, and what they've done is they've said, look, I'll basically give you infrastructure as a service. You still keep running your applications, data, middleware. And then, along came core banking systems in a box, e-commerce in a box like WooCommerce or Shopify, and they've said, look, I'll pretty much take over your entire platform. You just run the front end. You just run the client manager on your side, and we'll run everything else for you. And then, of course, you get to something like Amazon or WhatsApp or Netflix, where everything is sitting in the back end, and you're basically buying access to a complete service, so software as a service. So we've basically moved from a world where the client manages the entire infrastructure, the entire stack, to a world where the vendor manages the cloud. And so on the left-hand side, you can see lots of customization, very high costs, and a very slower time to get to value. And on the right-hand side, we can see standardization with lower cost and faster time to value. But this didn't happen overnight. This transition that you see here took us something like 12 years to get through. I recall way back in the early 2000s, we were talking about cloud when I was the chief technology officer at Standard Bank. We were playing around with cloud, and people were laughing at me when I said to them, you're going to run your entire bank on a cloud. And so, here we are. We've evolved through this process, and we've implemented exactly this architecture. And there are consequences when you do this. At the same time, not only did we take our legacy architecture and move it into the cloud, but we took our front-end client-side applications and we virtualized them. So instead of having very processor-heavy devices on the front end, we can now run with appliances, personal appliances, and you create basically a virtualized desktop. Everybody's got them. Nutanix has one. I think Oracle's got one, Google's got one, Microsoft, I think, has a virtualized version. Basically, Microsoft 360 can basically run as a virtualized desktop. And so basically what we've done is we virtualized the front end, and we basically allowed you to take your productivity and collaboration apps and move them into the cloud, and you had a very skinny browser-based often application or a very small client-side app running on the client's desktop. So we basically took everything out of the middle. We hollowed out the whole of our IT infrastructure, and we basically threw everything into the back. And at the same time, we also hollowed out the client-side applications as well, which, by the way, worked very well. I was talking to NetBank the other day, and they were telling me that because of the reason that they've done this, that they basically implemented, I guess, workplace of the future, they were able to very rapidly migrate into a world where they were able to rapidly provision and support 6,500 people suddenly working from home. So the three key systems in the architecture that were tested simultaneously was the client side, which is basically the laptop and the customer's home network, the internet connectivity, and the cloud system. So all three of these were stress tested. It's really instructive to look at what happened in those stress tests, because this is really going to guide us in terms of what's market ready and what we need to be thinking about for the next 10 years. The first thing is let's look at the internet itself. How did the internet cope with this load? So this is the increase from Cloudflare on the change in internet traffic that was seen by date. You can see the date, and this is per different country in Europe. So if you have a look at Verizon, for example, video on their network was up 41% to try to deal with the fact that people were working with business applications across the internet. VPN usage jumped by 65%, which tells you that actually companies were not ready. They suddenly realized they had many people working from home and suddenly realized they needed to implement a VPN so they could set up a security tunnel for their secure communications. Well, and there's been a 10-fold increase in collaboration tool usage. Now, all of this was quite a shock, clearly. And also, if you look at the total volume of traffic going through the DE6, which is the Deutsche Commercial Internet Exchange, we in South Africa have Jinx, for example, and if you look at the flow that they were hitting, it was something like 9.1 terabytes, which was a total peak for them. So, so in summary, internet traffic was peaking, VPN usage was peaking, which put another load because you've got the encryption layer running through that pipe on top of everything else. And of course, the key point here is it's clear that a lot of this was a knee-jerk reaction because you can see the number of customers that suddenly realized they needed to set up a VPN. Downstream activity went up roughly 20%, upstream went up 40%, and that's according to Cox Communications. And basically what that meant was, because many of these internet service providers run with surplus headroom, they basically have basically what the Germans call Luft. They've got space, they've got excess capacity, and what they try to do is to keep 50% of their capacity utilized. Basically, what happened is when this occurred, they suddenly ended up being 18 months in front of where they were. So they weren't planning on having volumes like that for between 12 and 18 months. So there's a huge investment wave now moving into the internet industry because suddenly all the internet service providers have realized that all their headroom has vanished. And that obviously meant that a number of their nodes suddenly were very stressed. In fact, you'll see that in some of the slides coming up. The first thing that happened is a global slowdown in the internet. If you look at Ookla, looked at global fixed broadband and mobile broadband. Globally, fixed speeds went up slightly and mobile speeds also went up. Now, why did mobile speeds go up? Well, mobile speeds went up because there were so few people who were mobile. We were all stuck at home, and most of us globally were using our fiber networks and our home Wi-Fi. In South Africa, we saw quite a different thing happen. We saw that the fixed network increased dramatically in speed, 16%. Why is that? Well, that's because nobody was in their offices using the fixed network. Most of us use, most of the demand in South Africa actually comes out of commercial property, and we weren't in our commercial property. So the fixed network actually saw a speed increase, and in fact, the mobile network went down. And the reason for the mobile network in South Africa going down is we were all using our dongles and our Vodacom dongles and we were actually using 4G to the tower, and we were using Wi-Fi in our home, but 4G to the tower. And so the problem in South Africa is that the mobile network took serious strain. And that's really a big lesson for us if going forward, is the fact that heavy dependence on the mobile network is a problem because you can't scale a mobile network as easily as you can scale a fixed network. So clearly internet congestion control is going to be a big problem in the future. The next thing that happened is a number of serious ISP outages. So if you look, this is a 1,000 Eyes report. If you look globally at what was happening, you can see a number of key nodes globally were going down, and a number of key IP addresses were taken out. We then saw that the residential loop, I'm sorry, just to share with you what actually happened is a number of the POPs got taken out. So in other words, that's the nodes that connect tier 1 networks to tier 2 networks to tier 3 networks. A number of those were basically taken out because they hadn't been scaled for this kind of traffic from tier 2, tier 3 networks to tier 1 networks. There was one very significant outbreak in the United States called the Century Link outage, which caused quite a lot of trouble. And the other was the Tata communication system outage. So clearly we saw the internet becoming stressed, we saw the bandwidth getting used up, we saw the headroom vanishing, we saw the nodes come under pressure, we saw the POPs come under pressure, we saw the interconnect between the different tiers come under pressure. And then of course what people never realized is, although you've got 70% of the network being video, suddenly it gets to 100. Now, when it goes from 70 to 100, you've got a real problem here because that's all happening on the residential network. Now, the residential network was never designed for this because normally during the day, if you have a look at the bottom right-hand side, you can see on the left, in the day, you've got a few houses that are actually accessing the internet and a large number of inactive users. Well, the problem is when everybody's working from home, the last mile takes a major hit. And so what you've now got here is a very strong exposure of the fact that the weak link in the chain where the system gets overloaded is going to be the home broadband network, firstly within your own home, and secondly between your home and your closest exchange. And so that's clearly going to be the second area where there's going to be huge attention paid. So my sense is we're going to see big investments in the mobile network because you've seen the drop in service quality. There's going to have to be an upgrade in the last mile, and there's going to have to be significant upscaling in nodes and the interconnects and the backhaul as well. So in summary, this is what Comcast gave as their summary. Comcast is one of the big ISPs in the United States. They said usage went up 32% during this time. Network traffic began to plateau in some of the early COVID markets. So in other words, once you hit COVID, the consumption spiked, but the minute the COVID began to plateau, the network began to plateau. LTE speeds went down. So in other words, mobile networks became slower. Wi-Fi speeds went up. And what they found was gaming downloads were up 50%, streaming was up 40%, and weekday usage on the residential network was up over 200%. You can see now nobody designs for this kind of significant switch. At the same time, the downstream and upstream peaks shifted. Where the downstream peak would normally be at 9 p.m., after the COVID had hit, it had shifted to 7:30 p.m., not a huge shift. But if you design your network for a particular time, you may have a problem now. And the real problem was the upstream network. Basically, it maxed out. You had a peak running from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. now. And so that gave you a sense for how a normal ISP, that's a residential consumer ISP, took a huge hit because suddenly all the business traffic moved from the corporate ISPs to the consumer ISPs, and you can see they weren't really set up for that. Although they've made the point that the network was running well and that they were running 700,000 speed tests every day just to keep the network running well. So if you look around the world at how the internet coped in different countries, there's a measure called the Internet Pressure Test. It's produced by Casper Data House, and basically they looked at the COVID-19 impact on internet pressure by measuring the change in the return trip time. And you can see countries like Malaysia, Ecuador, Colombia, Israel, even Israel took major hits there, and you can see a significant impact on the internet pressure as COVID hit. And again, that's an indication of the move of network usage from urban into suburban areas, and this heavy volume of workload coming from the networks coming out of homes. So that gives you a sense that the internet held, but we've got a big exposure now. Now we understand where the failure points are, and we understand there are a number of points on the internet where we really need to be throwing a lot of money at this, and one hopes the powers that be will do so. So now let's look at cloud. Well, 2020 is the year of the cloud, because if ever there was a year that demonstrated that cloud was the right thing to do, this was the year. Because if there was ever a year for a perfect COVID storm to hit us, 2020 was the perfect year for a COVID storm. Investors thought so too, because if you have a look at the share prices of companies that were players in the cloud computing sector, so areas such as AI, cloud computing, software infrastructure, wow, those shares really took off. They were on quite a binge. And basically the message that's gone out is that by design, we put together fully managed cloud databases that were fault tolerant, auto-updating, self-healing, elastic scaling, as well as having automated proactive management, which basically meant that many of us could work from home while our applications were running in the cloud. And teams that didn't have this, of course, were sending out teams to site. And of course, there were huge problems because there were quarantines running. In some areas, a particular company would be hit, and the entire team for the data center would go down. So many companies split their data center teams to try to keep their facilities running. In Australia, for example, they actually locked their data centers down. They had people sleeping in their data centers for weeks and not going home, just to make sure that the infection didn't get into their data centers. By the way, many cloud companies have done exactly the same thing. In fact, many cloud companies have indicated that they prefer hiring military type people, because military type people know how to remain calm in a situation like this, number one. And number two, they're very comfortable going into a lockdown like this and remaining isolated and cut off from the rest of the world. So what was the impact? Well, because of the massive surge that all cloud players saw, the first thing that was done was obviously the ISPs began to throttle the networks. The service providers, if you were producing video, they switched from HD to SD, and the bit rates were reduced by Facebook, YouTube, and Netflix. UHD, for example, was unavailable at times. Many of the services, and we'll talk about this now with Microsoft, they basically took non-critical Microsoft 360 services offline. They said, sorry, this service is not available. So if you were trying to spin up a SQL service, you wouldn't be able to do it. There would be a latency, a very high latency running into hours. Many of the cloud service providers have now admitted that they actually did not meet their SLAs for 99% availability. Latency times, latency went up, so you saw response times obviously being impacted for the return path traffic. And in certain horrible cases, you saw drop packets. Now, this is quite serious because if you're running applications in the cloud and this is happening to your network, you've got real problems here, depending on the sensitivity of your application and how you've designed it, built it, and how you're managing it. So we saw a very interesting world where, for example, Facebook, which was stable during big events like Olympics and New Year's Eve, basically was required to reduce the bit rate on Facebook and Instagram videos, and they needed to add capacity. Google, for example, warned that G Suite may be affected if their data centers were affected. That's not a very reassuring comment, is it? Microsoft's comment, Azure took serious strain. Gaming was deprioritized on the entire network. Azure admitted that they did not meet their 99.99% availability target at all times. All places, in fact, they placed higher caps on free cloud services. They deprioritized, they prioritized COVID-19 related workloads. That's the other problem, of course, is you now start prioritizing other workloads over yours. And last week, the company acknowledged that they'd been throttling some non-essential 365 services, and a number of Azure customers in Europe were also hit restrictions in spinning up virtual machines. So clearly, no one can sit back and say that they've had a clear health check here. All of the cloud services took heat. Google's probably come out of this, I think Google came out okay. Microsoft didn't come out the best. Maybe they were more transparent, but Amazon certainly seems to have handled it the best. There's no reports of Amazon clients having any form of impact, which says a lot about their elastic computing infrastructure and architecture. Now let's look at the end user as I wrap this up. So for the end user, collaboration just got a whole lot more complicated because the number of meetings went up 23%. I mean, I guess you at 4Sight must have experienced exactly what's on this page. Our ability to focus went down 29%. Our after hours email went up by a quarter. Our work activity went down by a quarter. The meeting sizes tended to drop. You had more meetings. And part of the reason for that is where normally you would walk along in the corridor and have a chat with somebody or walk over to somebody's office. Now that turned into a one-on-one Zoom call. And so the meetings grew in number, but the average meeting size dropped. Far more interruptions, far longer workday, although managers were far more responsive because basically they were all not tied up in meetings and they were able to respond quickly to their employees' queries. So that's the one impact that we've seen. The other impact, I guess, is many of us as users have stored much of our drives onto consumer storage in the cloud. And so there are reports of individuals having challenges with retrieving their data. And if this is one of your, if this is your company's strategy for user storage, this is also a problem because when you, for example, using Apple iCloud, and Apple iCloud goes down, many of the users have stored their data there and they can't retrieve their data, which, as you can imagine, is quite catastrophic. So Apple and Microsoft both carrying huge amounts of data, not to mention Google. The third big issue is what happens when we rush into distributed operations with lots of people working from home? Well, it's a cyber terrorist's dream. I mean, basically, cyber crime has spiked in this time. If you talk to the security officer at the World Health Organization, which obviously was a target because they were basically the tallest tree in the forest, They warned that hacking attempts against the agency and its partners had soared threefold. In fact, between 2019 and 2020, there's a 400% increase in attacks on healthcare infrastructure. Why one would choose to do that is beyond me. And next year, the expectation is that cybercrime is going to exceed $6 trillion. So clearly, there's going to have to be a huge increase in expenditure here. The amount of monetary damage is rising. And remember, we rushed people home to work from home. And there's a whole bunch of issues around security, liability, governance that we're in breach of, basically. And the reason is we just overlooked these things because we needed people to work from home. Well, the piper has to be paid at some point. And so at some point, you're going to have to fix these things. So if this persists, and I think it will, because I don't think all companies will go back to the way we were, we're going to have to go back and fix it. Why? Because if you look at employees' laptops, 1 in 4 devices have critical security apps that are out of compliance. And if you look at the percentage increase in sensitive data found on devices versus pre-COVID, you can see there's a huge increase in the amount of data that's now stored on laptops. Because we're working from home and many of us are not backing up our laptops, there's a huge move towards data piling up at the endpoints of our networks, literally moving data storage to the edge. And so this is hugely unacceptable, but clearly an opportunity if you're a vendor in this space. Mobile devices, we've used our mobile devices far more than we ever have. This slide only goes up to 2018, but I just wanted to show you that the trend line. The trend line is not great. It shows you the large number of malware samples being picked up annually on Android-driven devices. And if Android is one of your corporate, products that you are using, fine. But bear in mind, a lot of Android gets brought into the corporate system as a BYOD device. It's a bring your own device to work. And so Android basically gets added to your network. And the problem you have is the way you've architected your systems and whether the data is sitting in the clear on the device itself, because clearly the device is going to be compromised. So finally, what are the macroeconomic impacts of this? How should we think about the cloud environment going forward? Well, it depends what kind of recovery we have. Here are 9 different forecasts. Could we have a V? You can see the V here, which is a short, sharp hit. Could it be a U, which is a slightly longer hit, kind of a, U is slightly longer. Could it be a W? So in other words, it goes down, we get a recession, we come out of recession, there's a second wave, we go back into recession, but then we come out permanently. Could it be an L? We go down and we stay down for a long time. Or could it be this kind of, sudden sharp drop and a gradual recovery? Well, nobody knows for sure. Professor Robini, who's one of the only academics who actually predicted the 2008 credit crunch, he thinks it's going to be an L-shaped curve running for 10 years. He says we're entering the Great Depression, and it's going to be really bad. It's difficult to know, but at the bottom, I guess the point is, how badly will different countries be hit? China, Europe, America, the world. You can see, depending on whether it's a fast recovery, a delayed cure, or a profound recession, the European Union, for example, is going to be in big trouble if it's a profound recession. So the depth, duration, and cyclicality of this drop is going to be a key factor. We don't know for sure, but what we know for sure is it's not going to be quick. So if it's not quick, the work from home thing is going to work. Many companies can't afford to bring all their workers back, because if you have everybody in the office and someone becomes infected, everyone in that building has to go into quarantine. So that's hugely unacceptable. So many companies are saying 2/3 of the staff work from home, 1/3 of the staff in the office, and then you cycle them. That's probably the safest thing to do. The impact varies across industries. So if you look at telecommunications, for example, real estate, rental, packaging, equipment and transport, low exposure. If you look at things like the clothing industry, car industry, plane industry, very, very high levels of exposure. So the exposure varies. So you're not going to see a very clean view of what's happening. It's going to be quite mixed. Some industries will come back to normal. I know of some companies that have done better out of this recession. And I know most of companies have done worse. So if you're a face-to-face business doing manual, non-cognitive work, construction industry, fast food industry, healthcare, and some people in the healthcare industry, you are really going to be struggling in the next couple of years, probably. So the responses are clear. We had a crisis response. We stabilized the situation. We've got a gradual recovery. And here's the key point here. There has to be a process of redesign. You've got to take the lessons that you learned to redesign the system so that we're better prepared in the future for these types of events. Because it's clear that if COVID-19 could happen once, it could happen again. We're not sure if somebody's going to eat an armadillo or a bat or some other fox. Someone's going to eat something, and then suddenly you're going to get a jump in viruses between species, and you're going to get this problem all over again. So clearly we're entering a period of redesign, and there's going to be, I guess, a lot of soul searching around what we've built and whether we built it right. Many industries, I think, are going to keep their workers working from home because it suits them. You hear some industries, for example, that where it makes a lot of sense to keep people permanently working from home. I heard today that ABSA, for example, is shutting down its downtown offices in the middle of Johannesburg, and they're getting smaller offices in Benoni, and they've said to a lot of their staff, they're now free to work from home. And I think you're going to see a lot of this happening. So in other words, the corporate real estate market is going to take a beating in this because obviously the desire for big office space is going to plummet. And so finally, expect an acceleration of digital disruption. The digital disruption has been here since 1995. So this is not new. This is 25 years of digital disruption. The music industry, the photography industry, video rental industry was smacked hard in 95. In 2005, the print media was hit hard, TV, the travel industry. 2015, we saw the retail apocalypse. Telcos went into free fall. I mean, put it in context for you. MTN share price in 2015 was 250 Rand a share. I think today it's under 50, which is a 90% drop in the share price. And Vodacom's very similar. Cell C's bankrupt. Telcom's looking at restructuring their entire business. Basically, worldwide, the telco industry is in huge strain. And so we expect banking, retail, healthcare, all of these industries to go into, well, they took the hit in 2015. And by 2025, not that far out, pretty much there'll be no safe havens. All industries in the world will be smacked. Final slide. If you're not already migrating to cloud, right, you need to redouble your efforts. However, redundancy is critical, as you can see from this presentation, with multiple points of failure. So a hybrid cloud strategy makes a lot of sense. You have to split you have to probably run on 2 different clouds and potentially even some on-prem. And monitoring and managing your service specifications and levels is going to become a core competence, because when a crisis like this hits, your ability to orchestrate between clouds and across networks is key. Because we are not sure where the new normal will settle yet in steady state. So we don't know. As I said, V-shaped, U-shaped, W, we don't know. So because we don't know where the new normal will settle, so peak spikes are unfortunately already close to system capacity, and there's going to have to be an investment in the backbone network and internet infrastructure, which is becoming far more urgent. So we know we've got a constraint on the backbone network and the internet infrastructure. Also in South Africa, the mobile radio access network as well. Therefore, your cloud strategies will continue to be fluid, because you have to realize that you've got these multiple variables impacting you, and you've got to redesign your applications to be fault tolerant, to be resilient to latency, and to handle things like packet droppage, as well as reductions in quality of service and deprioritization of your service, because this is going to be the reality in the event of a next crisis, or even if the existing crisis continues to happen. Let me put it to you this way. What do you think would happen if another cable broke today, or if Google went down? What would happen? And I'll put it in context for you. At any moment in time, probably 5 to 10% of Google's entire appliances on their network in the data center are offline for basically problems on their power systems, problems on their internal network, software issues, factor X, we're not sure. I've got the stats, I can show it to you. So it's very scary when you realize that what's happening in the background of most cloud hardware infrastructures is a constant state of failure. So in other words, there are huge teams in those data centers running around replacing racks constantly. So your strategy better be fluid, while your security concerns will increase exponentially. And so I think we've got many miles to walk before we sleep. So to close out, here's a final quote from CIO.com. For CIOs, that adds an extra burden as the arbiter of access, security, and governance. To be sure that your platforms are robust enough to sustain all the jostling, because when the dust settles and business intelligence and data science have made sense of this post-pandemic world and moved on, you will be the one left behind to sweep up any customer lawsuits, regulatory fines, and data hacks. So folks, thank you very much. I hope that was a useful session for you. If you would like to get more information, you're able to get it on this pod link. You'll get a copy of this presentation. There's a book coming out called Divolution. You're welcome to access that. This podcast, as I said, I think it hit number 2 in South Africa, so you're welcome to read it. And if you go to that website, there's a lot of thought leadership stuff that I've posted there as well. So thank you very much. And yeah, I'm going to hand over to John. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Herman, for that absolutely brilliant and insightful presentation. We are going to do some questions and answers now. So I highly encourage everyone that's on the webinar to please drop your questions into the live event Q&A, and we'll go through them one by one. Herman, I just want to double check. Will you send through the presentation for us, and we'll share it with the team afterwards?
I will do. We'll do, definitely.
Thanks so much. So a couple of things that I've picked up, and you went through a very interesting journey of building up the case, and really what stood out for me is in this time when there's a lot of uncertainty, does offer a lot of opportunity. And as many businesses are struggling, there are businesses that are pivoting and changing their ways of working because of this and being forced to. Have you seen any examples of these that have been popping up?
So I agree strongly with what you've just said. I think that's absolutely right. I think, a lot of people are running scared. I'm running around going, guys, when the time to be scared is when everyone's being brave. The time to be brave is when everybody is scared. And so right now people are scared. I think it's a great opportunity. I'm starting to see, banks starting to say, well, do we need head offices? Zoom's rapidly growing its footprint. I don't know if you saw that Slack has signed a JV with Amazon now. Yeah. To take on, the video conferencing world. I think you're going to find lots of examples like this. I'll give you another example. I think you're going to find a huge move towards virtualization companies, VPN companies, and companies that do desktop virtualization. Great time to be in that space. I think if you're a company selling security services for end user computing, mobile devices, laptops, great time to be in this business. And of course, for the guys who are selling plumbing, we are going to need a lot more plumbing. I mean, that's basically what this is. And a lot more tin, a lot more plumbing and a lot more tin.
No, absolutely. And I think this is going to impact. I mean, one of the questions we got from Mornay, he's saying this is what he's seen are some really interesting insights, in particular around the metrics you had around more meetings and less productivity.
Yeah.
With this new way of working, because I think this is going to be our new normal, really, for the next few months and into years, as you've pointed out. How do we manage this productivity? How do we put plaster onto this productivity? How do organizations balance this? What are you observing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I mean, I think the first thing that has to happen is we as individuals have to take back ownership of our diary. I mean, I think we've caused this because we're at home. We start our day much earlier, we end it much earlier, and we're working when we normally would be driving cars. That's the problem here, right? Yeah. And I think also remember we're in crisis mode. Every business is in crisis mode. I mean, I think February and March and April, I attended crisis meetings on every board I sit on, right? And so I think we've seen a surge, mainly because of the crisis. We haven't seen a steady state yet. What we have to do is to push back on our diaries, claim it back. That's the one thing that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. The second thing I think that's going to happen, I think, is as all this additional productivity works its way through the system, you're going to find that the urgency levels will drop. I also think that as we virtualize more, there'll be fewer things to manage. Right now, part of the problem is so much of our life is analog. Oh, I've got to rush to my office. I've got to get my stamp. I've got to stamp this piece of paper. I've got to get a photograph, And as all of that stuff disappears, I mean, I'm now having board meetings online. I haven't seen a board paper. I think I haven't seen a physical board paper in 5 years. I haven't seen one. because we're using digital board packs. As that happens, and as we simplify the workflow and the work life, and implement SharePoint, for example, I don't have to hassle to go and find documents. I go to SharePoint, I know where it is. As this starts to become the way we do business, think about the number of times you've had a panic where I can't find the link for the meeting. Are you sure you sent it? Right? And I'm scrambling and you sent it to my Gmail email address. It's not in my Outlook box. That kind of stuff where you're bouncing a link from one email address to another email address to get it into your diary, so you click on it for Teams. I do that all the time. Once we've worked all that out, I think life's going to become a lot easier.
No, completely. And I think what we're finding very interesting is this hyperconnectivity. So take what we're doing right now as within 4Sight. We've got hundreds of our employees that are now suddenly engaging with each other, engaging with you. They're seeing a great presentation that would normally have cost an absolute fortune to bring people together. It's changing the model. It's changing the way we're engaging.
You'd also have to pay me an insane amount of money.
Exactly. It's making marketers' lives very, very interesting because, we need to find new budgets for things.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's interesting. I think when we're speaking about conferencing and that sort of thing, you've spoken this. You mentioned Zoom a few times, and obviously we know there are a lot of collaboration tools and communication tools out there. Why do you think Zoom had that ramp effect in the last 6 months, regardless of COVID? Why Zoom?
Well, firstly, it used to be Skype. So I can show you a slide showing you that way back. Skype was launched, I think, in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And it was launched for phone calls. And then they were slow phone calls. Then they went into video, and the video was never great. And then if you wanted a quality of service, you had to pay extra. It was not feature rich. And then Skype got bought by Microsoft, and then Microsoft converted it into the Microsoft platform for collaboration. And I think so part of the problem was Skype never really filled that role. And then along came WhatsApp, and WhatsApp was never really industrial strength. And setting up this kind of thing on WhatsApp was never really there.
Security was an issue.
Security was an issue. Absolutely. Yeah. And it was weird because Zoom ended up becoming the thing. And I think it's a totally serendipitous accident. They stumbled into success here. They happened to be right place, right time, right service.
I think there was this interesting observation as well. There's another company on whatever exchange Zoom is on, also called Zoom. Yes. And everyone started piling in, and they suddenly went up, and they're in some completely random.
I've got that slide. I've got that slide. It's called Zoom. The share to buy is Zoom Technologies, not the other one.
Yes, no, 100%. It's interesting. We've just got another one in, and we've got about 5 minutes, so we'll go through these questions, Herman. I mean, in our experience on the productivity side, Nick is pointing out here, in our experience, we felt that productivity has actually increased. Being a Joburg-based business, Pretoria-based business, a lot of our staff are not necessarily sitting in traffic, listening to 702, all that sort of stuff. Do you see that being a consistency? I mean, or is it a sort of a false positive that we all start suddenly hyper productive now? Can we sustain that productivity?
Look, I think right now the whole world's running on adrenaline. Right. So it's a crisis. We love crises. Everybody rise. I can jump higher than I've ever jumped in my life if there's 2 dogs chasing me. So basically right now we've got a crisis, so we're all working much harder. That's the one point. The other point I think is you're going to get burnout, and you're going to get you're going to get a serious problem because you don't have social interaction. And so the combination of physical burnout and the lack of physical interaction and face-to-face interaction is going to hurt at some point. I don't believe it's sustainable. I think you've got this for a while. We're seeing this by the way in data center stuff. IT staff globally are under massive pressure because of what's happening. So, and I definitely not sustainable over time.
No, 100%. So I mean, moving on, you brought in some very interesting metrics around internet traffic. That sort of thing. Now, in Africa, obviously, we are very unique in the position we have and how we are managing our traffic. We saw earlier this year, we saw a crunch when the cable went down twice off the coast of the Cameroon, and they had to fix that.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, about a month later, Facebook spoke about their investment. I think it's about $1 billion that they're now investing in cables. How do you see this actually impacting on Africa now? Because this has been a talking point for years and years and years, and It's all coming. We're living it now. We've got Microsoft that are landing data centers now.
Okay.
This connectivity is going to be needed. Where do you see this going?
So I mean, I took that out of my presentation. So basically, I've got a part of my presentation where I talk about what the tech giants are doing. And let me be very clear here. The only reason the tech giants are doing this is because they want the next billion customers. Their customer base has flattened out. And the reason those customers aren't online is that they don't have any internet. So Facebook was trying to launch a satellite with Elon Musk. It blew up. They then bought satellite time, and the logic was to basically to use VSAT all over Africa and to use Wi-Fi combined with VSAT to deliver Facebook services. So that's the only reason they're interested. That didn't work. Loon has been tried. Elon Musk is launching this new suite of satellites. Google and Facebook are both rolling out free Wi-Fi in India. If you go to a post office, you get free Facebook. If you go to a train station, you get free Google. I mean, they're all in this for the last mile. So basically, they want to bring 1 billion people on board. That's where this is heading to.
And that's so fascinating because you saw the investment that Facebook made in Geo last month. It was a $5.7 billion investment, and it's exactly for this reason. How do they get to the next billion? Because I think, and that's to my next point, is around 5G. You didn't touch too much on 5G, and I'm sure you've got a few sides that support that. Is 5G the promised hope, or is it just a bit of hype at this stage? What's your opinion?
There are 20 handsets in the world that support 5G. 20, right? And none of them is an Apple. So until there's an Apple 5G phone, America is an untapped market, right? Because I mean, America is basically an Apple market. So basically, Apple's sitting back and waiting. And I've been following what they're doing. Apple's busy changing their processor suppliers. They are now licensing Qualcomm radio equipment. They're drifting into 5G slowly. I don't believe that 5G is a consumer play. I believe 5G has two key roles. One, it'll help the network with network slicing or spectrum slicing. It allows a network to run 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G simultaneously in a much more efficient manner. You can basically it's called refarming. You refarm your spectrum. You basically make better use of your spectrum with 5G. That's what 5G does. So 5G is going to be a huge help to you in terms of making better use of spectrum. So it'll be very much a network side benefit, number one. Number two, 5G is perfect for solving last mile because it makes a lot of sense to basically put a 5G receiver in a home and to power that home internally, the home's Wi-Fi, using 5G to the tower and Wi-Fi in the house. You basically have a full, it's called FMA. It's a fixed mobile access system. And so the CPE, the client, the customer premises equipment basically becomes a modem that's a 5G modem with a Wi-Fi transmitter internally. I believe that is going to be how everyone's going to be getting broadband. It's going to be mobile, right? And you're going to be wondering, why is there mobile in the house? But actually, it's because it's the most efficient way of getting broadband to your home.
No, completely. I mean, I speak for myself personally. I've got a 40 megabit line, fiber line. But if I throw on LTE, not even 5G, LTE on my MTN card, I'm getting 80, 90 megabits a second. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. We look at, you made it in your conclusion. You touched on hybrid versus multi-cloud strategies. And for us at 4Sight, this is hybrid cloud in particular is critical to our core of how we are looking at things, being data-enabled, cybersecurity, and the cloud. Where do you see this being so important for companies in the future?
Look, the one lesson we've all learned now is all of these alliances that have been signed are meaningless. Standard Bank says I'm going Amazon, ABSA goes Google. I mean, I can't even keep track of who went where. The fact of the matter is, everyone's going to end up living in a multi-cloud environment. Why? Part of the reason is the applications that they buy. So SAP, for example, happens to be, SAP will give you SAP, or Oracle will give you Oracle running on a particular cloud infrastructure. They're not going to move that into Amazon. So if you partner with Amazon, you're still going to end up with an Oracle IBM cloud somewhere, right? So immediately you've got a dual cloud system. Then you're going to be using things like Zoom and Facebook and WhatsApp and other applications. So the fact is, by default, you're going to be running 5 cloud environments. So some of them are managed by somebody else. You are going to personally, I think, have to manage probably 3 cloud environments. You're going to have your private cloud, which is going to be within your environment, probably in your own premises. You're probably going to have, and you're going to have to do that because there's going to be certain data that you never want to leave your premises, customer data in particular. And there's definitely going to be a national cloud. Because there's going to be because of data sovereignty, there's a lot of customer data that can't leave the country, and then there's going to be a global cloud where you're probably going to run your big heavy lifting services, and you're going to have a huge backup where you're going to have to be, you're going to have to be mirroring your databases so that if you lose cable because of South Africa, if you lose the cable, you at least can run locally.
No, 100%, 100%. Herman, in closing, I think the biggest thing that we work with being a African-based business is a lot of what we're seeing is, and the impact of this is coming in from the developed world and now starting to surface in the developing world. We've seen now Latin America has become the new epicenter of COVID cases. Africa is on the horizon. We're coming into our winter now in South Africa. It's sort of closing statements. What do you see as this impact, this developing versus developed world impact, and how do you think it's going to impact us living here on the African continent?
Look, I mean, I think, I've written an article where I basically said I think we're going to end up back in the 1980s, but with cell phones and internet. That's basically where this is heading.
And no moustaches, no moustaches,
no moustaches, bell bottoms, right? And so basically, I think macroeconomically speaking, this is a huge hit. We've seen an 8% drop in GDP. Some of it's coming back, some of it's not coming back. Many firms have closed; they're never opening up again. So I liken this to a neutron bomb. What's happened, when a neutron bomb goes off, it lets off a lot of radiation, but a very, very low explosive charge. So what happens is the buildings and the bridges and the cars remain, but all the people have gone. And so I think what's going to happen is you're going to find lots of large empty buildings. You're going to find lots of secondhand cars. So basically, we are going to be asset rich, but cash poor. And so you've got to redesign. You've got to change your entire mindset for a world like that, because so much of wealth has evaporated. So many jobs have been destroyed, and I think it's okay. I think we'll build new jobs and we'll build new businesses. But I think you've got to use a value-centric view in Africa. Because of what's happened, everyone's going to rush to value. So anyone who can deliver more value for less cost, they're going to be the winners.
And fast. Absolutely. Herman Singh, sir, thank you very much for this presentation. To our team at 4Sight, this is going to be the first of many of these webinars that we will be doing through our Growth 4.0 initiative across the group. I really look forward to seeing some more comments afterwards. Herman's going to be sending us the PDF version of the presentation now, which we'll circulate, as well as the recording. Herman, I wish you safe. Be safe. It's cold this weekend. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Go well.
Take care now. Bye, everyone.
Bye.